We'll get back again for another deep dive with you.
Right.
You know, you brought some really fascinating material
Yes.
this time, and it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And like we always do, we're going to kind of, uh, you know, cut through the noise and extract the core insights here.
Yes.
And, you know, look at the big picture takeaways.
Right.
And you gave us primarily a YouTube interview transcript.
Correct.
So we're gonna jump into that.
Yes.
But first, I just want to kind of give a little bit of a roadmap, you know, like where we're going with this.
Okay.
You know, we're going to look at some of these extraordinary historical claims and some technological possibilities.
Yes.
And then, you know, how that kind of all connects into, you know, the significant global transformations that we're seeing and the ones that are on the horizon.
Yeah.
Especially in, you know, economics and how society is structured.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to see some overlap between the two.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And so it's, you know, I see this as a really potentially profound exploration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the past is informing the present so much right now.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
You know, and the historical claims are so unusual.
Yeah, yeah.
And have so much bearing on the future.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think a lot of our listeners are already familiar with some of this.
Yes.
So we're just going to kind of jump right in.
Okay.
You know, one of the first things that you had flagged, but I thought was interesting, was the whole discussion about the foreskin and, you know, mind-machine interfaces.
Yeah.
And the question was posed like, you know, can stem cells restore the foreskin, you know, for the purpose of, you know, piloting ships or operating power plants?
Yeah. Well, that was, I thought, an interesting question from the person who submitted the question.
Yeah.
Because it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about how stem cells work.
Right.
And that is that, you know, stem cells can only replicate what's already there. Yeah.
They, you know, it's like if you have a blueprint.
Right.
And you've lost part of the blueprint.
Yeah.
You know, the stem cells can't recreate the lost part of the blueprint.
Oh, I see.
And so, you know, so that was the immediate takeaway that I had was this, you know, that specific tissue, particularly the neuron cells associated with the nerves.
Yeah, yeah.
Once that's gone, you know, you can't regenerate that with stem cells.
Right. So regardless of what its function was, we can't bring it back.
Exactly.
With our current technology, at least. So, so no quick fix there.
Yeah.
But then it goes on from there to talk about, you know, some ancient languages, precursors to Sanskrit.
Yes.
And how there's some ambiguity around whether or not an intact or circumcised state was actually necessary for operating, you know, these mind-machine interfaces.
Yeah. So that's the fascinating part, right? Because we have, you know, we're dealing with ancient languages here.
Right. And, you know, the way that negation works in some of these older languages, you know, you can't always be certain.
Oh, I see.
So one interpretation is that an intact male is required to operate these interfaces. Okay. And the other interpretation is that it's the opposite.
Okay.
That, you know, the opposite is required.
Right.
And so, you know, that poses some questions like, you know, why would circumcision?
Yeah. If it was so important, why would we get rid of it?
Well, yeah. I mean, if this was a fundamental technology, you know, that was driving, you know, the civilization. Right. Then it just seems like an evolutionary
conundrum
puzzle, you know. Yeah. So, but you know, we just don't know. We don't have the definitive proof. Yeah. And you know, my team, we kind of lean more towards the intact male required position, but we don't have the you know, final proof of that. Got it. The other thing to remember is that we're talking about, you know, potentially different yugas here. Right. Yeah. We're talking about the Kali Yuga versus now. Right. And so, you know, the very nature of being human might have been different back then. Yeah.
That's wild to think about.
It is. It is. And, you know, and it may be that even though our fundamental DNA structure is pretty much the same, that the way it's expressed in the material world is different. Right. You know, because of the energetic environment.
Right, right. So there's so many different layers to look at this through.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, I think the main takeaway there was that,
Well, one of the main takeaways is that the language seems to point to intact nerve endings at the periphery of the body.
Okay.
So the hands and the feet and the penis.
Right.
And that was required for the operation of these devices.
So maybe like a direct neural connection.
Right. But we have to remember that these writings were imbued with a religious perspective.
Right.
Not a mechanistic perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so trying to interpret potential, technical descriptions through a religious lens, that's where it gets really messy.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so that was, that's a lot of uncertainty there, a lot of speculation.
Yeah.
But the main takeaway is that stem cells can't grow back.
Right.
Regardless of what it did.
Regardless.
That ship has sailed.
Right.
Okay, so moving on from there, another really fascinating claim that we wanted to touch on is this concept of primary water.
Yes.
Now, for those who are listening,
this is a really fascinating area.
It is.
Because it delves into the, geophysics and geochemistry of how water is actually created on the planet.
Yeah.
And so, the idea that was brought forth in the interview was that the Earth itself is a generator of water.
Okay.
And this term waters that have not yet been born was used.
Right.
And so this immediately raised a lot of questions for me. Listening to this interview, I was like, well, wait a minute. If that's true, then, couldn't the powers that be essentially, monopolize existing water and create shortages?
Create an artificial scarcity if they wanted to.
Right.
Wow.
And so the alternative that was presented was this primary water extraction technology.
Okay.
And the thing is that this technology is actually relatively inexpensive.
Okay.
Compared to something like desalination.
I see.
And so.
Wow. So is anybody doing this? Are they actually extracting this primary water?
Well, that's where the conversation got really interesting.
Okay.
Because they brought up Russia. And how Russia is, they're undertaking these initiatives to drill these super deep wells.
Okay.
And it's not just for petroleum.
Okay.
And their perspective on petroleum is that it's also a naturally replenishing resource.
Oh, so they're not looking at it like a fossil fuel that we're going to run out of.
Exactly. They see it as something that is created inside the Earth.
Okay.
And constantly being replenished.
Okay.
They're also, drilling these wells to access this primary water.
I see.
And they linked this to the whole, Arctic gas initiative that they have going on.
Okay.
And so, there was this one scientist that they quoted who estimated that there was, just an extraordinarily large reserve of natural gas in the Arctic.
Okay.
And so, this really points to a fundamentally different perspective that the Russians seem to have, not only in terms of abundance, but in terms of, their understanding of matter itself.
Right. So it's not just that, there's more than we think.
Yes.
It's also how is it actually created? What's the nature of it?
Exactly. And they seem to be much more willing to accept the spiritual dimensions of matter.
Okay.
Whereas, in the West, we tend to have this very, materialistic viewpoint, and it's just like, okay, it's just this inert stuff,
right. Yeah, like a mechanistic worldview.
Right. And so they were saying that, this primal water may actually have different energetic properties than, the water that we drink. That's on the surface.
Oh, interesting.
That's been, exposed to the elements, and all this kind of stuff. They see it as being denatured.
Wow.
And so, the interview was saying that, they've seen leaked corporate documents, where they're actually planning, this whole thing out.
Oh. And this is really happening.
Yeah, it seems to be, something that they're actively pursuing.
Wow. So if one nation really sort of, took this perspective and ran with it and controlled this primary water.
Yeah.
It could have some serious geopolitical, ramifications.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay. Moving on from there, they talked about Shungite.
Yes.
Which is apparently a big deal in Russia.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So Shungite is this mineral that's predominantly found in this region of Russia called Karelia.
Okay.
And it's up in northern Russia.
Okay.
And the claim is that it has the ability to block EMFs
Electromagnetic fields?
Electromagnetic fields, right?
Oh,
and, they talked about how, they actually have it in all their stores.
How?
People carry around these Shungite medallions.
Wow.
And the person being interviewed even said that they have a Shungite medallion that they wear, and they put Shungite in their water filter.
And they say their dogs prefer the Shungite water.
Yeah, well, that's what they said. They said their dogs will only drink the water that has the Shungite in it.
Yeah, that's pretty compelling.
It is.
And then they went on to talk about, these longevity studies that the Russians have done.
Yes.
In the Karelian area.
Yeah, and they talked about how, the people in that area, they drink water that's been naturally filtered by Shungite.
Okay.
And then they further filter it. They take it home and they filter it even more. Mm-hmm. And they said that, their lifespans are 11 to 18% longer.
Wow.
Than the average.
Okay, so this is like legitimate scientific research.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Okay. Wow. That's fascinating.
It is.
And then they go on to talk about how all Shungite comes from one place.
Well, that was that was really interesting.
Yeah.
So they said that it all comes from a single meteor strike that happened in northern Russia.
Okay.
And then they pointed out, the phonetic resemblance of Shungite to Carl and Elohim.
Okay.
And so that was kind of like...
So it's like, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Yeah, and then they go on to talk about, some old Russian and Chinese literature.
That suggests that this meteor strike was not a natural occurrence.
Okay.
It was one of 3 impacts that happened during an attack on Earth.
Right. When
humans were conquered.
Wow. So...
Okay, so this is like a whole different version of history than what we've been taught.
Right.
Wow. Okay, so then they talked about Edgar Cayce.
Yeah.
And his prophecy about Russia being the light of the world.
Right.
Now, I know you're familiar with Edgar Cayce.
Yes.
He was a devout Christian.
Yes.
And, a lot of people called him a medical medium.
Yeah.
And, he had this famous prophecy about Russia. And this was tied into, they brought up some popular Russian literature, like the Ringing Cedars and the story of Anastasia.
Right.
And so, Anastasia, she teaches this, the symbiotic connection between humans and the natural world.
Right.
They talked about this concept of putting a seed under your tongue and how that there's this DNA exchange that goes on between humans and the environment.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting because, we know that there's a DNA exchange that happens between a mother and an infant through saliva.
Right, like through breastfeeding.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, it's not that far-fetched.
Yeah.
To think that there could be, some kind of DNA exchange going on with the environment.
Yeah, and they even mentioned that there's this whole movement called Anastasianism now.
Yes.
With all these communities, all around the world.
All over the world?
They're actually living by these teachings.
Yeah, right.
So this is not fringe.
No.
This is like
This is a growing movement.
Yeah, a growing movement.
And it's interesting because, the perspective that was offered in this interview was that the West, our experience in the West wasn't really punishment.
Right.
It was that the controllers wanted to keep us, separated.
Separated from nature, separated from each other.
Right. And also to kind of foster this mechanistic,
Because,
very materialistic world.
Right. And so they pointed out, how Russia has actually been, putting out information about Tartaria.
Right.
And how you can even access this information on Yandex.
Okay. So like the Russian Google. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And so
this is all tying into this idea that, Russia's can be the light of the world.
Right. And it's because they retained this information.
They retained it. They didn't, completely eradicate it.
Right. They were overthrown, at the end of the Soviet era by, what they're calling the globalist elite.
Right.
And then they were able to rebuild,
Yeah.
And they see that the Russian Revolution as being less violent,
right,
than the American Revolution.
Right. Yeah, it was like a different, it was at the other end of a cycle.
Right.
Yeah. So that kind of sets us up then to talk about Tartaria.
Yes.
Because that was another big topic.
Right.
This idea of Tartarian architecture.
Right.
And so they were talking about how, there's no plumbing.
Well, they were pointing out that in a lot of these buildings, there's no plumbing.
Right.
No visible plumbing.
Right.
There's also no...
Like no toilets, no running water.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's no built-in food preparation areas.
Okay.
Like kitchens.
Like kitchens. Yeah. So
this led to some speculation about how are they getting rid of their waste?
Right.
How are they eating?
Right. Were they eating?
Were they even eating?
Right. Were they doing it all outside?
Yeah. Yeah. Or were they just, pooping in a bucket and throwing it out the window?
I mean, it's hard to say.
It's hard to say.
But the fact is that, we don't see the plumbing.
Yeah.
And we don't see the active heating sources.
Right.
But we do see electricity. Right. And often without the wiring.
Right. Without the wiring.
Which is fascinating.
It is.
And they were talking about, these drawings and etchings that they found of people,
right,
interacting with electricity. Like, it was just
like floating frisbees,
right,
and electrified dueling swords.
Yeah, like it was just an everyday thing for them.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
So, okay, so then they talked about, when did Tartaria exist?
Right.
And they said maybe the Gold and Silver Ages?
Yeah, that it possibly flourished during that time.
Which is how long ago?
Well, we're talking like 12 to 26,000 years ago.
Wow.
And the idea was that maybe, the galactic center was putting out a different, a more intense emanation of energy.
Okay.
And that this may have actually altered human physiology.
Okay.
And so maybe they didn't need to eat the way that we eat.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, so a completely different humanity.
Yeah, and the person being interviewed even said that, back in the 1960s, they were traveling all around Europe and they saw, remnants of these buildings.
Yeah.
And they were playing in these ruins down in southern Germany.
Yeah.
And they talked about the fireplaces and how unusual they were and the ventilation systems, how good they were.
Yeah.
And there is this unique, clean smell.
Okay, so you're talking about a completely different kind of human then.
Yeah, potentially mentally different.
Okay.
Because of these galactic center emanations.
And they called this like the dark time of humanity or the nighttime of humanity.
Right.
Okay.
And then they referenced some Sanskrit writings.
Okay.
From the descending Bronze Age.
Okay, so how long ago was that?
Well, we're talking 8,000 years ago.
Okay.
And they said that, the writers of that time, they were noticing that people were getting stupider.
What?
Yeah, they were like, what's going on?
Wow. And they tied that to...
And they tied it to these galactic center emanations.
Okay.
And they said that, the Earth's position had changed relative to some obscuring mass.
Okay.
And so the emanations were being reduced.
Wow, so we're in a rising phase now?
We're in a rising phase now.
So we should be getting smarter.
Supposedly.
But they're saying that, the globalists are trying to...
Well, yeah, they're saying that the globalists are trying to suppress that.
Suppress it.
By, promoting the mechanistic worldview.
Right, by dumbing us down, by distracting us.
Right. Okay.
Wow.
And then they just briefly mentioned, they talked about remote viewers.
Yeah. And I know you've had some experience with remote viewing.
Yeah, and they were talking about how, I think I accidentally tapped into the Elohim.
Elohim.
The Elohim were anxious.
The Elohim were very anxious, yeah.
About this shift.
Yeah, and I'm not sure where they were located.
I got a sense that they were either on the moon or in Antarctica, but they were very anxious.
Okay.
About this whole thing.
Wow. Okay, so cosmic forces at play.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on from there, they talked about Ral.
Yeah.
And dragons.
Okay, so this is where we have to, kind of get rid of that image of the fire-breathing reptile.
Right.
Because what they're saying is that the myths and legends of dragons do not stem from real creatures.
Right.
They stem from Ral.
And what is Ral? Which
are the fire-breathing spaceship of alien visitors.
So UFOs.
Yeah, essentially.
Okay.
And they were talking about how, the word dragon actually, it goes back to Sanskrit and older. And it's describing, rocket ships.
Okay.
And if you look at all these myths, especially the Chinese myths,
right.
You see these gods riding dragons. Well, they're not riding reptiles, they're riding spaceships.
Right.
And the dragons are always depicted as, powerful.
Right.
But subservient.
Right, like a tool or a mount.
Yeah, the tool of the gods.
Right.
And so they're suggesting that, maybe in the future, our encounters...
with aliens or with extraterrestrials.
Are going to involve these dragons.
These dragons, these UFOs.
Right.
In a more prominent way.
Right.
Okay, and then from there, it goes on to talk about water as a weapon.
Yeah.
Now, this is where it gets a little scary.
Yeah. It's like...
they were talking about old fart works.
Yeah, they use that term.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, they did.
But essentially what they're talking about is, these ancient Chinese ideas about ships that had mind-machine interfaces that could manipulate gravity around water and mud.
So like lifting water.
Lifting water.
It's a weapon.
Wow. And then they were talking about like dry hurricanes.
Yeah. These unusual weather events.
Yeah, like mud inexplicably falling from the sky.
Right.
And just obliterating whole areas.
Right. And a lot of times these were Tartarian settlements.
Really?
Yeah.
So maybe Tartaria was destroyed by some kind of...
Could be.
Water weapon?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And then the last little tidbit, they talked about the moon.
Yeah.
And this whole idea that, in order to operate on the moon, you need water.
Yeah.
And these ships are coming to Earth.
Yeah, and they were saying, that they're getting the water from lakes and from the South Pole and Antarctica.
Yeah. And this all plays into, this idea of a tainted history.
Right. We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
That,
we may have been brought here.
Right. We brought to a planet
that
already had a society.
Right. And our history is all messed up.
Right.
We don't know what really happened.
Right.
Wow. Okay, so that was a lot of unusual claims.
It was a lot.
A lot of, alternative history.
Right.
Some pretty out there stuff.
Yeah.
But, okay, so let's switch gears now and talk about the future.
Oh, yeah.
Because that was the second part of this interview.
Right.
A lot of perspectives on, where we're going.
Yeah.
Especially in terms of economics and societal transformation.
Right.
And so, we had a question from you about the 1929 stock market crash.
Yes.
And, how does that compare to?
Well, I was trying to get a sense of scale.
Yeah.
In terms of the emotional release.
Right.
How would a future crash compare to that?
Right.
And the expert in the interview was explaining that, they have this whole way of looking at things where they use historical events, like the 1930s crash, to define levels of emotionalism in their data system.
Okay.
And they were saying that, the 1930s crash,
it wasn't an isolated event.
Okay.
It was part of a process.
A longer process.
Right.
Okay.
And they were talking about, the fall of the German mark and, the rise of the petroleum society.
Okay.
And then they threw in this really interesting idea that petroleum is not a fossil fuel.
Okay.
It's the second most abundant planetary material after water.
Wow.
And it's created inside the Earth.
Wow.
And so...
Okay, so we've been lied to about that.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
But anyway, they were saying that the 1930s crash, it was a slow process.
Yeah, it was a slow process.
It was very isolated.
Okay. Why was it isolated?
Because communication was so different back then.
Information traveled slowly.
Right.
Okay.
And they were saying that Rockefeller was actually, the one who created the conditions for that crash.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it started in the early 1920s.
Wow. So it was a long con.
Okay, so what's different about a future crash?
Well, they're saying that, because of global communication, everything is so much faster now.
Yeah, information travels at the speed of light.
Right.
Yeah.
And so any kind of crash that happens is going to have a global impact very rapidly.
Okay.
And they said that, cryptocurrencies are going to play a big role.
Okay. How so?
Well, they said that, as fiat dies, crypto is going to surge.
Okay.
And we're going to see, all these new instant millionaires.
Millionaires created overnight.
Right. And it's going to be global.
Wow.
So it's not going to be like,
like in one country.
Yeah. It's going to be like, hey, cousin Tom and, wherever just became a multimillionaire.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a lot more visceral.
Wow. Okay. So then from there, they talked about this whole fiat implosion.
Right.
That's coming and a walk away.
Yes.
What is that?
Yeah.
Expert speaker.